Let's talk about some eukaryotes. So, this is our one little foray into things with a nucleus. I will mention some of the diseases that are caused by eukaryotes later in the course, but this will be our time to kind of look at the structure and just some basic things about fungi, algae, protozoa, and worms. We're going to start with fungi. So, I think it's actually kind of interesting about fungi because this is a field that is shared by both microbiology and botany. So things like mushrooms, those are things that more plant people kind of are obsessed with. We in microbiology are most interested in things that have either a microscopic lifestyle or are fermentors. So the interesting thing to know about mycology, which is the study of fungi, is that fungi are super diverse. Like they are actually like all over the map in terms of how they get their food. There's actually some interesting fungi that are classified as carnivores. They actually hunt for their food, which is so weird. I think most people think of fungi as just sort of like plant-like structures that, just whatever, decompose things. But we're going to focus on yeast, which is a single-celled fungal organism. If you've ever cooked with yeast, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Mold, because they can provoke allergic reactions from breathing in some of those particles. Mold is a little bit like barbed wire in your lungs. And there's occasionally people who eat like a bad mushroom, like if they don't know what they're doing, like they're mushroom hunters or whatever. But I would say poisoning is the most common disease associated with those. Here's just some cool microscopic fungi. It's yeast up at the top. Yeast is just this cute little sort of pod, but at least it has a nucleus, so you wouldn't confuse it with a bacteria. Penicillium is on the bottom left, that purpley flower, and then you can kind of see some spores, like some fungal spores, in those fruiting bodies on the bottom right. Top left is a picture of black mold. It's just so bad if you inhale black mold in your lungs. It just like rips it to shreds. And the bottle cap fungus is on the bottom, which I just think is so cool because it ejects its spores to replicate like faster than any other organism on this planet. It's got the highest velocity that we've ever been able to record, which is just cool for like a little microscopic fungus. We do see some interesting toxins coming out of fungi, and I actually think it's really interesting to live in Oregon because I think Oregon is more progressive about looking at certain types of fungal byproducts as therapeutic agents. They're experimenting with using fungal like chemistry for treatment of PTSD and depression and bipolar. I guess it is amazing. So like I just think it's really cool to be in a state that's kind of open to looking at how those things might help. The little worm in the top right corner is actually a nematode. It's a soil worm, and the fungus that is in the area around it is sort of circular. It makes these little circular nooses, and as the worm swims through that little circle, there's a little trigger, and it kind of like cinches down and strangles the worm. It literally makes a trap for a worm so that it has food to eat. It's just so cool. That's the carnivorous fungus. Remember this kind of three-domain tree of life scenario, and what I'll point out is that fungi is right next to animals. And I think that's really important for you to know because you have more similarities to fungal organisms than almost anything else, which means if you get a fungal infection, it's going to be harder to treat with potentially more side effects because you and a fungus have more in common than a bacteria or other types of microbes. In terms of growth forms of fungi, we'll see kind of two main forms. The first is like a cellular filamentous growth. It looks a little bit like a root, but it's not a root because it's not a plant. It's just like this little extension of cells called hyphae. And those hyphae basically form these tangles called mycelia. And you've probably seen those and mistaken them for spider webs, but they basically form these like little fuzz balls in like dirt and soil and stuff. Fungi can reproduce asexually as a spore. Remember, this is not an endospore. It is a very easy to confuse term, but a spore is just like a seed of a mushroom, and an endospore is more of an individual survival cyst for bacteria. If you do see mushrooms, that's basically a spore like emitting fruiting body. So here's kind of a picture. We've got a spore that kind of like hatches out, and you can see it forms a cellular kind of branch, which is hyphae. And if those hyphae form like a mass, it is a mycelium. And this is actually a picture of a mycelium. So you probably thought this was like a spider web. Like I see these a lot in the spring when it's really wet. But it's actually a fungus that's coming from underground, and that's just like the visible like mass of hyphae, the mycelium, that's in that one little area. The actual organism can be really, really big, and most of it's going to be underground. Typically, a fungus likes things a little dry and acidic compared to other types of organisms like bacteria. But fungi do a lot of work for us. They're critical in terms of like recycling our nutrients, and they do secrete their digestive juices externally, which we have enzymes, which means we put food into our body and then the enzymes are on the inside. If we barfed out our enzymes, they would also be considered exozymes. So exozyme just means an outside, digestive enzyme, basically. And if you want to be a farmer, you're going to need to learn fungal ecology, because it's the fungi in the soil that provide the nutrients for the plants to grow all the vegetables and the crops that we need to survive. So these things go really hand in hand. And I will say that there are some really important diseases that we won't have time to talk about because they're not human diseases. I'm particularly interested in some of the fungal pathology that's happening in animals like bats, because it's really ravaging bat populations. But I would just say be open to taking further micro classes and learning about some of the other organisms that suffer from diseases out there, because they're really susceptible, and bats are really super important for keeping bugs and other types of parasites out of our world. And they're dying from this fungus that infects their body. It doesn't kill them, it just takes up all their energy, and then they're starved to death, basically. It's awful. Our next type of eukaryote are actually bugs. So arthropods are basically insects, and we do see two different types of insect problems. The problems with bugs is that they can both carry disease, and they can both be a carrier or a host for a specific type of parasite. So if it's a mechanical vector, it carries with it some kind of microbe on its mouth as it bites you, and it just inserts that microbe randomly into you. Doesn't matter what the bug is. But a biological vector is actually a really specific part of a parasite's life cycle, and these are extraordinary. It's a particular mosquito or a particular type of tick. They carry certain types of microbes, either in their mouth, or in the case of malaria, it's an Anopheles mosquito is the biological vector, and it carries the malaria parasite in its saliva glands. So when it drinks your blood, it kind of inserts its little saliva first, and then it inserts the parasite for malaria right into your bloodstream, which is just crazy if you think about it. So I do care about these two vocabulary words. The mechanical vector is kind of just random. Doesn't matter what the bug is, it just got gross stuff on it, and it just lands on poop, and then it lands on you, and suddenly you have poop bacteria contamination, versus a biological vector, which is really a specific species that just has this very particular type of life cycle. And I'm going to throw spiders in there. I think of spiders as bugs, but they're not actually insects. They have a different number of creepy legs. Bedbugs are a mechanical vector that are kind of awful, actually. They live inside your furniture, and then they are nocturnal, so they come out at night and then they bite you. And the biggest complication from a bedbug is actually a staph infection. It's actually a bacterial infection from the bite wound. It's not like they have venom or anything like that, but they're pretty awful. Mosquitoes are potentially a mechanical or a biological vector, but they're probably the most dangerous as a biological vector for things like malaria, Zika, West Nile, definitely diseases that we'll talk about later. But man, there's probably not a more successful predator on the face of this planet. And I have like literally tried every type of mosquito repellent, from like the good ones to like the lavender oil or whatever, and every year I fail. Crabs and lice. I think the one on the right really looks like a crab. It's just awful. These are bloodsuckers, so they tend to be pretty obnoxious, and I just think they kind of look like little insects. And so when we talk about treating them with insecticide, that's why. Fleas have kind of a bad reputation for plague, but they're also bloodsuckers, and I think that fleas probably prefer animal hosts, but like in the event of, they can jump over and they can definitely cause reactions and diseases in humans. Worms, we have a couple worms that I want to mention. These are helminths, parasitic worms. They are animals. They are eukaryotes. These are actually in your group of organisms. So even harder than treating a fungus is going to be treating a worm infection. And we should all be lucky that we live in a place where there's not a ton of worms in our food, because there are places in the world where you don't take your shoes off and you never eat the ripe fruit. So worms kind of come as flat or round, and because they're chemoheterotrophic, which means they eat food like you do, they want to eat your food, or they want to eat you as food. So we'll start with flukes. So there's tons of different types of flukes. Most of these are kind of freshwater parasites, and they would be happy like parasitizing whatever's living in the pond or whatever. But they can, in some cases, get inside humans, and they can cause pretty bad side effects or even sepsis and death. These are pretty rare here, but in parts of like warmer regions, like definitely Central Asia, this is a bigger problem, and you just don't swim in fresh water that's warm and stagnant. Like that's kind of the rule. Intestines. The scolex on the left is sort of the head, I guess. That's got hooks and suction cups to attach to your body's surfaces. And then the little square chunks are actually reproductive units. It's a true hermaphrodite, which means it has male and female reproductive parts in each square. So all it needs to do is separate those squares and allow it to kind of float through the fecal stream. And if it gets ingested by another host, then it's ready to go. So here's the tapeworm life cycle. It is fecal to oral transmission, which means it's coming from a contaminated person's gut as feces. And usually, we don't go around eating feces. Some animals do, though. So we would probably see the most likely transmission by consuming a contaminated animal. So like pig is a really good example of a feces eater, basically. And if you don't consume healthy pork and it maybe doesn't kill everything from cooking, you would basically get ingestion of a tapeworm from that way. And I will say it's very interesting to me that there are some cultures that don't eat pork, like it's dirty food, and you can kind of see the distribution of where there's a lot of tapeworm, like historical infection, in regions of the world like the Middle East, where it's just not food. They don't eat pigs. But we consume quite a bit of pork in the United States. We just kind of have surveillance so that it's not, full of worms. One worm that we do have quite a pretty good abundance of is pinworms. And usually this is coming from like very small children being infected. This is a worm that basically colonizes the anal area and causes itching. And I'll say that it's basically most common in children because they have very poor hand hygiene and they're not inhibited when they're itchy somewhere. They just scratch it and then they touch everything. So like basically this goes around in daycare, preschool, elementary schools, those types of things. And it is treatable, but it is it's pretty obvious when there's uncontrolled, butt itching. Okay, algae. Algae is less funny. So algae is kind of half animal and half plant. It's so interesting to me. It starts its life as an animal and it starts it out kind of like a typical larva and then finds a nice rock and then it turns into a plant like a kelp. I mean, it's crazy. These are photosynthetic as adults and they can get quite large. I think kelp forest off the Oregon coast can be upwards of 400 meters. Like, that's huge. Like, they're just like these old forests of like seaweed. Here's what the taxonomy looks like. The green is algae, and the red is actually protozoa. So things like amoebas and paramecium, things that are definitely more animalistic in how they move and how they eat and stuff. So genetically speaking, algae is like all over the place. And I actually don't know what it is. Like, it's really pretty interesting that way. Here's a typical green algae. One of the cool things about algae is it's really easy to identify the color, and that's the category of the algae. So there's green, yellow, green, golden, red. The one that I want to most point out to you is the Dinophyta, which is responsible for toxic red tide events. And you should know we have red tides on Oregon coast all the time. And it basically produces a paralytic toxin that poisons all the fish, and if we eat the animals that have that toxin, we can actually get sick. It's not like we eat a lot of algae. We eat the animals that are living in the algae, and it doesn't kill them, but it definitely is responsible for a certain number of fatalities a year. It's kind of why the crab season gets postponed every once in a while. If you pay attention, it's getting more and more common. I read a paper about a decade ago about a truck driver in France, I think, that was hauling rotten seaweed basically away from the beach. They have a bunch of like fancy beaches over there, and so they wanted them nice and clean. And the gas from the decomposition of the seaweed actually killed the truck driver. And I think that happened a couple of times, and I'd never heard that before. So I'm also going to put on your radar that there could be off gas from decomp of algae basically that could be toxic to people. It's never happened in the United States. I don't think we have this type of algae, but you never know. Protozoa are sort of in those other categories from algae. They can be photosynthetic. They can be interesting. And these are just all over the place. These are like amoebas and giardia. There's paramecium. There's just all sorts of weird things in there. And they have all different kinds of characteristics. Some of them are asexual. Some of them have budding like a plant. Some of them have sex. It's so weird. They're just a crazy group of random organisms, and I don't even know if they're related, really. There are a few diseases that are interesting. Toxoplasma gondii is really interesting. It's a cat parasite that can get into people. It can cause basically symptoms of schizophrenia. Trichomonas vaginalis is, I think, probably the most common STI in the world. A lot of people have never even heard of it, but it's actually a protozoa. It's not a bacteria. And of course, malaria, which is huge. And I definitely want you to remember Plasmodium malaria is caused by a protozoa. It's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It's actually one of these weird little eukaryotic, unicellular, strange little creatures. Here's an example, like a ray. It's an amoeba at the top. Those little kind of purple guys with eyes are Giardia, which is gnarly. Giardia is from drinking contaminated fresh water usually. And then it's just like a little rotifer on the right. Those are the kind of common ones that we see in Oregon, like in fresh water. Amoebas can get into your brain and cause some interesting infections. I've seen a couple cases like not too long ago about people using neti pots with well water. And well water is not filtered or treated. And basically if you're inserting water up your nasal passageways, the amoebas can basically get right into your brain and can be very difficult to survive that. You could also get it from swimming, but I don't know, it's just, I would say, on the rare side, but just use distilled water if you're going to put water up your nose on purpose. And then spider bites. I think spiders are really interesting because there's about 17,000 people who go to the ER every year claiming to have a spider bite, but they never actually saw a spider bite them. They just kind of woke up with a little purple spot or something like that, and they just have kind of learned through their life to blame spiders because they're creepy. So you should know that most spider bites are not actually spider bites. They're actually staph infections that people just assume it was a spider that somehow stalked them in the middle of the night. But I will acknowledge there are spiders that do have venom and they can bite you. Usually spiders are kind of, doing their own business, and if you're moving wood outside or something, they might, be defending themselves. But if it is a spider bite, it would be like a wound that doesn't heal very well, and it can actually start to get like a little ischemic or lack of, healing and maybe even dead tissue. That's certainly a possibility, but most likely it's just a little staph infection, and even if it is a spider bite, it's still usually just a staph infection from having bacteria on their little spider face. But you should know there's a lot of misidentification of spider bites, and it's really just because we've learned to hate spiders.